Welcome to The Catholic Couch, the official podcast of the Catholic Counseling Institute, where we integrate the beauty of the Catholic faith with modern psychology to give you real tips for real life. I'm Amber Pilkington, Catholic therapist, wife, mother, and woman who knows that scrupulosity and intrusive thoughts are some of the most common reasons that Catholics come to me for help. We're trying something a little different today. We're doing a long-form, more casual episode where I can just talk to you and share some information that I think would be helpful. Today's episode is a sit-down, heart-to-heart, especially for Catholics who are trying to love God and constantly fear like they're failing. We're going to talk about what scrupulosity actually is, what's going on in your brain, and what the Catholic Church actually says about scrupulosity and sin. And then I'll give you some practical tips and help you understand why you may be really confused if you've gone somewhere like YouTube and looked at videos for scrupulosity. If you've ever struggled to find peace in your prayer life where anxiety gets in the way, this episode's for you. Let's go. So today we're going to talk about something that is in this realm of silent suffering that I think many Catholics struggle with to varying degrees and find it really hard to talk about. Today we're going to talk about scrupulosity. First of all, I think it's important to discuss the reason why you might be really confused if you've looked at other videos for scrupulosity. In the YouTube and online world, I've seen many wonderful videos about scrupulosity, some even from priests. And I think it can be confusing because what I see is that sometimes the word scrupulosity is being used as an adjective to describe a tender conscience or a sensitive conscience. And when you talk about scrupulosity in that way, there can be a certain understanding, certain application and ways to help with healing. But sometimes they're talking about scrupulosity as the actual clinical definition. So the first thing I want to help you understand is that even though the same word is being used, we can be talking about different things. The first thing to ask yourself when you're looking at a video about scrupulosity is, how is this person using the term to describe a tender conscience or the clinical term? Something I can't do is tell you if you have clinical scrupulosity. Diagnosing has to be done one-on-one with a qualified mental health professional, but something I can do is give you helpful information. So that a lot of people don't know is that clinical scrupulosity is actually a subtype of OCD in its most extreme presentation. When we think about OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, a lot of times what we think about and have in our mind is what we see on movies or on TV, where the person is counting over and over or cleaning excessively or washing their hands. Scrupulosity can be a subtype of OCD. In OCD, the person has an anxiety prompt or a fear trigger, and then they have a ritual or a compulsion that may or may not make logical sense, but it helps calm the fear. For example, if I'm really worried about germs, I have the trigger, I'm worried about the germ, and then something that I do to calm that fear is to wash my hands over and over and over again. And this can get tricky, especially coming out of the virus we have all been through. There's a practical level. I want you to wash your hands when you come home or after you go to the bathroom. But the way that this is different is when it takes on a life of its own. One of the ways you can decipher between is this, quote, normal behavior or thinking, or is this starting to edge into that clinical area, is if the type of reassurance or compulsion or ritual that you need continues to grow. One of the little known facts about anxiety is that it never stands still. If we're not actively working against it, it will grow. Maybe you've had this experience in your life when at first a certain number of minutes washing your hands was effective in calming your nervous system. Then you had to start doing more or using a different soap. And this is just one example, but that can also happen with prayer. So when we understand this dynamic, that there's the trigger, the anxiety, and then the compulsion or the ritual that soothes the anxiety temporarily, we can see how this can apply to mental rituals as well. In scrupulosity, you have a fear of a spiritual nature, but then you have a mental compulsion. It's not something that someone can see from the outside. So maybe you worry that you didn't say your penance right, so you do it over and over again. Or you didn't genuflect with the amount of reverence that you should. And so you do it over and over again. You didn't say your novena with enough devotion in your heart, and so you have to say it over again. These rituals and compulsions can also happen in our mind. They're invisible. People can't see them. But what I want you to hear and understand is that the dynamic can be the same. The other thing that I want to be really clear about is that unhealthy behaviors exist along a continuum. And so maybe you've had some times in your life when you felt like you had to say a prayer multiple times, but it was fleeting, it passed, and you were able to move on. I'm not saying that if you've had any of those experiences that you have OCD. It has to reach a certain threshold before it's diagnosable. One of the reasons I wanted to start this channel is, like many other issues in mental health, the sooner we can intervene, the better the outcome is going to be. Because every time that you engage in a ritual or seek reassurance, you actually strengthen that thought loop. The longer that goes on, the more strengthened that thought loop is going to be, the more difficult it can be to break. And what you will likely see is that it gets bigger and generalizes to other things. One thing I tell my clients is that scrupulosity is about anxiety. It's not about faith. Part of what we have to do in treatment or in healing is, I think of anxiety as this little gremlin that likes to get its sticky claws onto things that are really important to us, like our faith. And part of what our goal is in healing is to separate those two and to not let our anxiety use our religion, our relationship with God, the desire we have to be holy for its own purposes. It makes me think of one of the quotes that was in my thesis and article on shame and guilt and the sacrament of confession, where the church says that the faithful should use the social sciences to help us live a more free and mature faith. When we can get anxiety to remove its sticky claws from our religion, faith, and relationship with God, we're able to live it more freely. The problem is anxiety and OCD, subclinical OCD, wherever we are on this scale. One of the things that you will see, and this happens with intrusive thoughts as well, is that these concerns, these intrusive thoughts, these worries tend to cluster around the things that are most important to us. I also want to talk about and help you understand how this is functioning in the brain. A lot of my clients have told me that when they understand what's happening in their brain, it can really help to normalize it. And I love being able to share this information and see their whole body relax. Part of what I want to do here on this channel is give that information away so that it's accessible to people, because more people need to know about this. Just know that scrupulosity, intrusive thoughts, often coexist with anxiety and perfectionism. You can also be more susceptible if you had a fear-based attachment system or experienced trauma. There can be lots of different reasons why this happens. But here's what's going on in your brain. One thing that we know is people who struggle with scrupulosity and OCD, or somewhere on that spectrum, tend to be more creative and tend to be more sensitive. So what is creativity? Creativity is taking things that are not similar and putting them together, finding a link between them. Normally, when we think about creativity, we think about it in a positive sense, like coming up with a great idea or doing a painting. But your brain can also be creative in a way that causes a lot of distress. So you can see how this is creating the perfect storm where your brain that's feeling very anxious is taking important things and distressing things and putting them together. And then when you combine that with someone who is more sensitive and more distressed by those thoughts, then that gets linked. We believe that everybody has some form of intrusive thoughts or scrupulous thoughts that they've experienced them at some point in their life. A lot of times people are able to say, that was weird, or wow, I must be tired, or where did that come from? And kind of move on. But for other people, they get stuck. I call it a sticky brain. One thing that primes the brain to be sticky is an overactive amygdala. The amygdala is the part of your brain that is the fear center. It's the panic button. It's where the fight or flight response originates. It starts sending signals to create that physical cascade in your body. So the other thing that's going on is there's a part of our brain called the cingulate that is the error detection center. If the front part of your brain has this thought, oh my goodness, I just failed this test. I'm going to fail out of college. I'm going to lose my scholarship. my parents are going to hate me, I'm never going to get a job, and I'm going to die lonely under a bridge. Then it's Singulate's job to come in and say, hang on, slow down. You've actually failed a test before and you were able to bring your grade up. Maybe you're not going to get an A, but it's not going to be the worst case situation. Or, yeah, this is really bad, but it doesn't mean that you're going to fail the entire class. So when the Singulate is not as active, then the error correction abilities of your brain is lessened. So you're having these thoughts, and the part of your brain that's supposed to error correct maybe isn't as active. Another thing that's going on is that people with often have an overactive insula. The insula is the part of our brain that helps us understand our own experience of our body. So if you're cold or if you're hungry, insula will tell you what's going on. The insula, especially the anterior insula, is often more activated in religious OCD. This part of the brain helps us feel disgust or guilt. When it's hyperactive, that guilt feeling may feel bigger than it really is. One of the primary cognitive distortions that's going on in scrupulosity, and when I say cognitive distortion, I mean thinking error or unhelpful thought. Maybe you've heard them called negative automatic thoughts. But one of the primary things that's going on is confusing facts and feelings. So it's when you say, I feel so guilty about this thing, or I feel a lack of peace about this, so it must mean that I am guilty. And we call this confusing facts with feelings. We have to bring that logic part of our brain back on and know that if we are following our feelings to let us know what's true and what's not, sometimes that can lead us astray. We also don't want to ignore all of our feelings, but it's about a healthy relationship between the two. So I often tell people that our feelings are real, but not necessarily true. So when you have a distressing thought or a trigger, and a distressing thought could be that you didn't say your penance correctly or with enough contrition, and then you say it over and over again, the problem is that you do get that immediate payoff. The reason people do compulsions or these rituals or seek reassurance is because they work in the short run. But it also tells your brain this thought or this feeling is dangerous. And so it flags it and strengthens that pathway. The more you have a certain thought, the more likely you are to have a certain thought. And that's how these things can grow. It's important to look at what the church really teaches. God is not a God of confusion or fear. Scrupulosity is not a sin. It's actually profound suffering. The Catechism also teaches that we should avoid rash judgment. Everyone should be careful to interpret his neighbor's thoughts, words, and deeds in a favorable way. That's from the Catechism, paragraph 2478. But in this case, we're applying that same kindness to ourselves. We need to turn that inward. We know that for something to truly be a sin, we have to have full knowledge, full consent, full freedom. Someone experiencing scrupulosity or an anxiety disorder doesn't have that kind of freedom. Now, I tell clients that, but I tell them, I'm only going to tell you that one time, because reassuring ourselves like that can become a compulsion in and of itself. What's so difficult is that the standard of care for treatment for OCD and scrupulosity is exposure and response prevention, which means we expose you to the thing that you are fearful of. We expose you to the trigger and then don't allow that response or that ritual. Your anxiety will likely peak, but then if you stick with it long enough, it'll start coming down to baseline. And that teaches your brain, oh, this thing is not as dangerous as I thought it was. And then the next time it happens, that anxiety will come up, but not quite as high. And then it will go down a little bit faster. Over and over, we begin to unpair this stimulus and response. Because what's happening is your brain is believing that the rituals are what is actually creating safety, because after the ritual, you experience a reduction in emotion. You feel calmer, more peaceful. What that tells the brain is this is the thing that created that safety. But the reality is that's not what's going on, because you weren't in danger to begin with. You see how these things get linked? When clients experience any change in therapy is a function of learning. It's either learning new skills, strengthening new brain pathways, or unlearning or weakening pathways. Therapists may not always describe it in those terms, but that's really what's going on at the brain level. We're giving your brain a chance to sit with that anxiety, to sit with that uncertainty, to lean in. And it's almost like an exposure. You learn slowly that this thing is not as dangerous as you thought, or not dangerous at all. If you can do something like this on your own and see benefit, then that's fantastic. You're probably at a subclinical level. If this seems impossible, that's when you really want to be working with a mental health professional that can help you through this process. We will help you create a hierarchy where we don't start with the most difficult thing. And there's all kinds of imaginal exposures and things that we can do to help teach your brain that this fear response or this response is not needed for you to return to safety, that you can return to safety or feeling safe even without that ritual. It's uncomfortable for sure, but it absolutely can be done. More than anything, I'm just wanting to give an overview of how this is working, because this is a very different process than someone who just has a sensitive or tender conscience. We also remember that there's a lot of saints that struggled with scrupulosity. I would just give a gentle caution that when you read the writings of the saints about scrupulosity, that you're asking yourself, are they talking about a tender conscience here? Or are they talking about a clinical anxiety disorder? The underlying dynamics are very different, and healing happens very differently. Scrupulosity is an incredible suffering. It feels like you're walking on spiritual eggshells. Every decision feels high stakes. You love God, but you're terrified of disappointing him. You're exhausted after prayer. You have dread after confession, and you have hypervigilance during Mass, or any combination of those. You may also experience checking, confessing the same sin repeatedly, Googling morality questions, even avoiding Eucharist when you are truly not in a state of mortal sin. This is such a painful cross that people experience, and something that I have found that most people really don't understand. As I mentioned, the gold standard treatment for all forms of OCD is exposure and response prevention. With the help of a therapist, we learn to sit with the possibility that you've committed a sin without acting on the compulsion to confess it again. We learn to label the thought. That's a scrupulous thought. I notice that I'm having a scrupulous thought. Thought diffusion, where we name a distressing thought, we don't engage with it. And by naming it, saying in your head, I notice that I'm having a scrupulous thought, or that's one of those scrupulous thoughts. It gives us a little bit of distance. And then we can also watch the thought pass, like you're watching clouds pass by in a window. We don't have to be engaged with every thought, and not every thought that we have means something deep. And this can be really hard for Catholics, because for those of us who take our faith very seriously, we tend to be deep thinkers and deep feelers. We have strong emotions connected with our faith. Remember that one of the purposes of emotion is to signal salience to your brain. What I mean by that is one of the jobs of emotions is to flag your brain to say, this thing is super dangerous. Let's reinforce all around this and make sure that this doesn't happen again. For example, if I walk outside and I see a snake slithering past, or I'm stepping off a curb and a car comes around the corner that I didn't see and I almost get hit, I'm going to have a really strong emotional response to that. Part of what that emotion is doing is giving me information about the environment. It's also preparing my body for action. Another thing it's doing is signaling to the brain. It's like highlighting it or putting a tab on it. We call that salience. The intensity tells our brain there's something important here. But what happens a lot with scrupulosity or intrusive thoughts of a religious nature is that we have an incredible amount of emotional intensity because this is a topic or an area of our life that has extreme value, not because there's something dangerous going on, but the brain gets confused. Remember, your brain's job is to keep you alive, but not to make you happy. It would rather detect a danger where there wasn't 1,000 times than to miss a danger. Your threat detection system is always weighted towards the negative because it's a survival response. Your brain is likely misreading the intensity of that emotion to mean something different. The intensity of the emotion is there because this is such an important thing to you, not because it's signaling a level of danger. Another thing that we can do is try to limit reassurance. If you're not really sure if you're at that clinical level or not, if you should reach out to see a therapist, as long as you're safe, I think it's okay to try limiting that reassurance. What happens when I don't allow myself to say that prayer over and over again? What happens if I say, I'm not going to allow myself to Google if this is a sin or to ask others about it? We kind of lean in to that trusting in the mercy of God to help us through that exposure. But I also want to be very clear that many times I've heard people say, well, if you're scrupulous, it means that you don't have a trust in God's mercy. And to the scrupulous mind, that's just throwing kerosene on the fire. Because now there's another thing to worry about, that maybe my fear actually means that I'm doing something, but you aren't. This is about neuroscience, not theology. That being said, we can use grace and trust in the mercy of God as a tool and as a resource to help us get through that exposure period if it's something that can be helpful to you. There's a really thin line here, and this is where it can be really helpful if you're unsure to work with someone individually, because something that might function as reassurance to one person might not be for another, which is why it's also really hard to make generalized content like this, because the way people experience scrupulosity can be so different. But I'm hoping to give a wide enough overview that it gives you some information. You've got some practical steps that you can try. You can also work on some somatic regulation. What does that mean? Somatic means the body. Intensity of the emotional response flags the brain. Well, when you have the fear and your anxiety is triggered, we can use some somatic exercises, things like deep breathing or progressive muscle relaxation, to try to help ourselves manage in that period of exposure so that we can get through it. Again, this gets really tricky. Remember that anxiety that's reassured continues. For some people, coping skills can be very effective. And for other people, it can actually make the anxiety worse because they become a way of avoiding the anxiety, which strengthens the fear. We're not going to solve it in an hour or in a podcast, but keep that in mind. Some spiritual reframes. I always suggest that if someone is struggling with scrupulosity, let your confessor know and have just one confessor. Going from priest to priest can be a form of reassurance. But also, if you have one confessor, they're seeing a bigger picture, a more full story. And I suggest that people not go to confession more than once every other week or even once a month at the beginning. Remember, we're not telling people to stay away from the sacraments or that sin isn't a big deal. We're going through a process to help get those sticky claws of anxiety off of our faith life. So there's a middle period here where that may sound completely counterintuitive, that a Catholic therapist is saying, don't go to confession as much. But the reason behind it is so that these loops can be weakened, that anxiety's claws can get taken off your prayer life, and so that you can reclaim it again as yours more authentically and with more peace, the kind of faith life that I think that God wants you to have. I would reinforce that feelings are not always facts. When we take a feeling and because we feel something so strongly, it can make us believe that the intensity of that feeling shows just how true that thought is. But that's not always how it works. Just be careful that feelings are real, but not necessarily true. To help you along the way, I've created a free downloadable PDF that is a letter to a confessor about scrupulosity from a Catholic therapist. It's a short one-page letter that you can download and bring to your confessor. I've been pleasantly surprised how many priests, especially younger ones, understand the difference between scrupulosity as a tender conscience and scrupulosity as an expression of clinical anxiety and how you have to deal with them differently. But look, they cannot know everything about everything. I'm a therapist, and that's why we specialize in certain areas. And so this letter is just something to help them. I even offer my email if they'd like to learn more or like to talk one-on-one. I'm always happy to do that as a courtesy to priests to help. Remember that we're also praying for peace, not for certainty. Anxiety loves certainty. We want to be sure. But there's some things that cannot be known for sure. And there's an element of uncertainty in faith that makes it faith. So what we're praying for is the ability to have more peace with the uncertainties in life. There are questions that can't definitively be answered on this side of heaven. And I get that that's really, really hard, but just know that peace is possible. We're trying to lean into that uncertainty and to get more comfortable with that gray area. If this has become so distressing to you, I would highly suggest that you work with a therapist. I can give you information and an overview, and hopefully that can be helpful. There is a place for psychoeducation, as we call it, but this is not a substitute for therapy. And one thing that I know for sure is that you deserve peace in your life. If you're struggling with this cross, you deserve healing. I believe God wants that for you. And sometimes that means bringing in an expert, someone who respects your faith, someone who's not going to ask you to do something contrary to your faith, but someone who also understands that scrupulosity is not about religion at its heart. It's about anxiety that is using religion because it knows that's how it can get your attention. I decided to make this episode because Lent can kind of kick up feelings and thoughts about scrupulosity because we're talking more about sin and about penance. And so it's not uncommon if you've seen some of these feelings and concerns kind of be kicked up a notch. I'm trying a different format, which is a little bit more informal, that I can give you some more information. And it's just me having a conversation with you. Let me know what you think about this versus the more polished videos you've been used to seeing. Also, let me know if there's any content ideas you'd like more podcasts about. We can talk about anxiety, we can talk about grief, we can talk about ADHD and what that means for Catholics. I'm here to help. If it's within my areas of specialty, I started this channel because I want to give important information out to the world. As a final thought, you're not crazy. You're not alone. You're not the only Catholic who has felt this way. In fact, this is very common. God is not angry with you for your scrupulosity. He knows that it's suffering and he's hurting with you. He wants peace for you even more than you want it for yourself. Scrupulosity can look holy and pious on the outside, but we know that when we are operating out of fear, not out of freedom and love, that is not coming from God. Scrupulosity is not a sin. Scrupulosity is about anxiety. And I hope this episode has been helpful to you. So until next time, I'm here for you. You're not alone. And remember, I'll always leave a place for you on the Catholic couch.